With functionalism, we move on to Neo-Functionalism. The title just gives an idea that there was a functionalism which might be considered something old, and we move on to something which is a new functionalism. Well, it's not a new functionalism as such. Well, functionalism had a perspective, had a theory. Well, although we have a label like new functionalism, there is no such theory as an outcome of this concept. Well, this concept or neo-functionalism was a response to a barrage of criticism which people had against the functionalism. We see that structural functionalism declined in its significance from the mid-1960s onward. We see that there were other changes in the American society at about the same time. We see that something like anti-war movement, the war which was going on outside America, people didn't like it. People were, let's say, very vocal, and they were against that kind of war. Then we also see that civil rights movement, again, more like a democratic approach where we see that people are fighting for the liberties of the people, rights of the people. And then we also see that there was a growing popularity of neo-Marxist approach. Neo-Marxist approach is more like a conflict approach, more like a critical theory approach compared with the functionalist approach. So we see that Parsons' image of value consensus resulting in social equilibrium was being, let's say, challenged. It was being questioned. So typically a functionalist approach which was, let us say, given by Parsons, it was more like a conservative kind of approach, looking for a static society, looking for equilibrium in the society, and that was challenged, that we don't see that there is equilibrium or a permanent kind of equilibrium for all the time to come. Also, we see that there were other perspectives which competed with this approach, like symbolic interactionist perspective. So that was another, let's say, let's call it as an alternative to functionalism. So that is what we see, that the traditional functionalist approach was being challenged, or challenged by the people due to various changes coming in the society. So there was some kind of fragmentation in the functionalist perspective. So we see that mid-1980s, a major effort was made to, let's say, revive this theory under the heading of this new functionalism. So this was more like a revival of the previous approach of functionalism rather than the creation of some new theory of functionalism. So major contributors were Jeffrey Alexander in the US and Richard Munich in Germany. So neo-functionalism was used to indicate some kind of continuity with the structural functionalism, and also to make an effort to extend structural functionalism and overcome the different, let's say, criticism or the different difficulties which it was experiences. So it was, neo-functionalism may be defined as a self-critical strand of functional theory that seeks to broaden functionalism's intellectual scope while retaining its theoretical, let's say, core. So we see that in this definition, structural functionalism was seen overly narrow. So it was previously considered as a holistic kind of thing, a big theory which is covering all the aspects of society. So we see that it was considered as overly narrow. That's not the case. So the goal was the creation of a more synthetic theory labeled as Neo-Functionalism. Although there was a strong synthetic core in the theory when Parsons was looking into the integration of a wide range of theoretical inputs. So Parsons showed the interrelationship of major domains of the social world, and these domains could be the cultural system, the social system, and the personality systems. Although later on we see that Parsons adopted little narrow structural functionalist orientation, and the focus was more on cultural system, which was dominant and which was considered as determining the other systems which we see in the society, that is the social and the personality systems. So we see that neo-functionalism can be viewed as an effort to recapture such an orientation. So Alexander enumerated the problems associated with structural functionalism, and these in this approach they wanted to surmount, to overcome the problems which were being experienced by this approach, and these were like anti-individualism, antagonism to change, conservatism and idealism, and anti-empirical bias. So we see that perhaps over here in this perspective, we see that there was more domination of the, let's say, cultural system or the society, where individual is more like a passive. And also another criticism was that this was a theory which was a static kind of, talking about the static society where there is no change. So in that context, we could consider it as a conservative approach, and we see that it was considered as anti-empirical. So despite his enthusiasm, that is Alexander's enthusiasm for neo-functionalism in the 80s, he was forced to conclude that neo-functionalism is more like a tendency rather than a new theory. So they did not develop any theory. It was more like revival of the structural functionalist approach.